Welcome back to I Hate TikTok Pseudopsychology. My name is Silly Goose, and I'm going to debunk a fun, popular psychology myth that has been, making its rounds over these social media platforms at an exceptionally high rate, especially as of recent. Now, this popular psychology myth has made its rounds previously and is still widely thought to be held as truth, but it's getting particularly bad. And said myth is that the brain stops developing at 25. We'll get into why that's a myth in a second, but I want to first, do this a little bit backwards and tell you the consequences of this popular psychology myth. The reason why I'm making this video is because I have seen an uptick of people essentially advocating to raise the adult age to 25 because of this myth. I'm seeing people say that you shouldn't be able to drink until 25, you shouldn't be able to smoke weed until 25, get a tattoo, do any sort of cosmetic surgery. I have even seen, and this is the comment I wish I got a screenshot of, sometimes I see comments and I don't think I'm gonna make a video on it. And later I'm like, fuck, I actually want to make a video on it, but I didn't get a screenshot of the comment. This is one of those times. But I saw a comment that even said that they wanted to raise the voting age to 25. It's even gotten nefarious to the point where it is actually being implemented into real life, real policy, real laws. And what I mean by that is not only are they using this in court to defend 18-year-olds that decide to commit mass murder, they're also doing it to transgender people down south. And by down south, I mean the United States South. There was a bill proposed in Oklahoma called the Millstone Act, which essentially says that you cannot physically, medically transition your gender until you are of the age of 25. And this bill will forcibly detransition several years of, already transitioned transgender adults. And what's even worse and even more infantilizing about this is that the act is named the Millstone Act after a Bible verse which cites the need to, protect children from all that shall harm them, which implies that a 24-year-old is a child. So not only have they just implied that anyone under 25 is a child, which I find extremely fucking infantilizing, but they've also basically just forcibly detransitioned a shit ton of already medically transitioned transgender adults. The results of this are nefarious. This isn't a cute pop psychology fact anymore. Now you guys are just causing real-life problems. Nicholas, you just hate this because you're almost 22 and you're not a 25-year-old. Yeah, no shit. Oh no, the person that might be affected by this is upset? Wow, who would have fucking guessed? I'm not entirely sure what the end goal is, restricting a shit ton of things to people of age 25 and older, and leaving 18 to 24-year-olds in this weird limbo of adult childhood. Legally, at the very least. I'm not going to say that what you're suggesting is worse than being a child, because a child is essentially considered property. If we're looking at it from a legal standpoint, children are considered property of their adult parents. So it's not as terrible as being a child, but it certainly is a weird limbo that you've put us in, where you're advocating to essentially make us half adults, where we don't get all of the legal rights of an adult, but you're still going to force us to pay taxes and get a job and shit of that like. We don't have legally our parents or the government to fall back on. Like, at the very least, even if they are considered legal property, children can fall back on their parents and don't have to work, and they can get, their shit paid for, or they're supposed to at the very least. But you're advocating for like this half adult status where I still have to, pay my fucking rent, but I'm not allowed to smoke a cigarette. Are you fucking serious? Anyways, not the point. I can sit here and analyze why you guys hate young adults so much and why you want to advocate for taking away rights from legal adults. But truthfully, I'm going to make this very simple as to why this is happening. People hate children and people hate disabled people. That's why this is happening. They want, because your brain is not fully developed, they want to take away your, rights as a legal adult, which is straight up just ableism and hatred of children. I mean, we could get into, youth liberation here regarding, children and their autonomy and how they should have it. But it's just flabbergasting that you guys hate children and you hate disabled people so much that you are now deciding to, talk about taking away the legal rights of adults just because you have an idea of how a brain should look before you have autonomy. Bonkers. Anyways, now that I've put down the moral reasons why this is bad, let's, break down the science of why this is not even correct in the first place. This, your brain stops developing when you're 25 bullshit is not even true. There is no actual evidence of that. Now, how did, we come to this point in the first place? How scientists figure out that, the brain does keep developing into early adulthood was via, fMRI scans. They, took pictures of the brain. They analyzed said pictures, and they've, realized that the prefrontal cortex may still be developing until early adulthood. That's not a myth. That is true. In fact, and I'm going to put on the glasses now, there is a 2016 study called When is an Adolescent an Adult? Assessing Cognitive Control in Emotional and Non-Emotional Contexts that states, the results showed diminished cognitive performance under brief and prolonged negative emotional arousal in 18 to 21-year-olds relative to adults over 21. This reduction in performance was paralleled by decreased activity in frontoparietal circuitry, implicated in cognitive control, and increased sustained activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex involved in emotional processes. There is data that supports that the brain does keep developing into early adulthood. That is true. However, this magic number of 25 that you guys just pulled out of your asses, there's no grounds for it. It lacks significant nuance about our brains, and it also completely just overlooks the fact that brains change and grow our entire lives. First thing before I continue to cite sources and shit, we need to acknowledge the fact that neuroscience can be considered a soft science, especially when it comes to interpreting, fMRI photos of brains and whatnot. There is an element of subjectivity that is reliant upon the interpretations of the researcher. It's much like psychology in that way, which makes it a soft science at times and makes it pretty subjective, so that is something to keep in mind. Additionally, a lot of this data comes out of, the global north, Western countries like the United States, so we don't have, that data from across the world to compare to, because I do think environment is a very important thing to take into consideration when it comes to brains. However, this, does not mean that neuroscience and psychology are bad sciences. It just means that there is an element of subjectivity that needs to be taken into account and limitations that need to be taken into account when dealing with, these types of studies. With that considered, it's important to note that the pioneers of these researchers even think you guys are out of your minds. I have, from a Slate magazine interview, several quotes from researchers in this field that find that this is a weird takeaway that you guys have created from their research, and I'm going to read you some of them. The glasses are going back on. Alexandra Cohen, the lead author of the study I referenced earlier, even said to Slate magazine in an email, "I don't think there's anything magical about the age of 25. Additionally, a psychologist named Larry Steinberg, who's done like 40 years of research on development in adolescents and adults, also said in a Slate interview, "I honestly don't know why people picked 25, he said. It's a nice sounding number. It's divisible by 5. And additionally, and this is a direct quote from the Slate interview that I've got here, Kate Mills, a developmental neuroscientist at the University of Oregon, was equally puzzled. "This is funny to me. I don't know why 25, Mills said. "We're still not there with research to really say the brain is mature at 25 because we don't have an indication of what maturity even looks like." While neuroscientists do agree that the brain does develop into early adulthood, there is no consensus on, when the brain stops growing, and they certainly, don't understand why you guys just picked out the number 25. And they certainly also don't agree that it necessarily is a measure of maturity. In fact, measuring maturity is a game that you will never win because brains are silly. It's just unbelievably subjective and individual to each person. A lot of neuroscientists try to define maturity as like when the, development and growth of a brain sort of plateaus, but that is a different age for each person. And that's not only considering the prefrontal cortex either. A lot of this, our brain stops growing at 25, has to do with the good old prefrontal cortex, which is, that rational decision-making part of the brain, to put it, very broadly. But like other parts of the brain, like the occipital lobe, for instance, are just as important as the prefrontal cortex. And, their rate of growth and, their ability to change and develop does differ from the prefrontal cortex, and they do need to be taken into account. The obsession with the prefrontal cortex is a little weird. Putting the glasses back on for another direct quote, Leah Somerville, a Harvard psychologist, writes in her research paper, "Searching for signatures of brain maturity, what are we searching for?" that the brain maturation is a multi-layered process that does not map onto a single developmental timeline. She also writes, "Structural development continues to progress for a surprisingly long time. One especially large study showed that for several brain regions, structural growth curves had not plateaued even by the age of 30, the oldest age in their sample. Other work focused on structural brain measures through adulthood show progressive volumetric changes from ages 15 to 90 that never level off and instead changed constantly throughout the adult phase of life." So that entire, your brain stops growing at 25 thing, yeah, complete bullshit. We have data that suggests that some folks continued to develop until they were 30, not to mention other parts of the brain, from 15 to 90, never stopped, shifting and changing and developing. So, your brain never really stops doing silly shit. It's a hunk of meat in your head. It's gonna do fucking weird things, bro. In fact, in my opinion, 25 is such a weird age to come to because a lot of these studies cite 21 as the age that's sort of the turning point. A lot of these studies say that in the functioning of key brain areas, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the 18 to 21-year-old's brain activity during threat conditions was more similar to a 13 to 17-year-old reference group than a 22 to 25-year-old reference group. So, why 25? If you need to absolutely pick an age to start, taking away folks' rights, why was it 25? 18 to 21 makes way more sense here, considering the amount of evidence we have that suggests that their brains are pretty similar to, 13 to 17-year-olds. So, what's the fucking deal? And Leah also writes in the same paper regarding a study called The Prediction of Individual Brain Maturity using fMRI, and this is done to, calculate the brain age of participants aged 7 to 30. And while there was an identifiable pattern in the data, Leah does write, however, these data also illustrate the challenges of applying general patterns of neurodevelopment from group-based to individual inference, as there is substantial variance in brain network connectivity that is unrelated to age. For example, some 8-year-old brains exhibited a greater maturation index than some 25-year-old brains. Trying to figure out when someone is a real adult, you're not going to be able to do that. It is so varied depending upon the person that this is all for naught. This is not a worthwhile endeavor. All brain different, all brain silly. To recap, neuroscientists, professionals in this field, and some of the pioneers of the research that you cite don't even know what the fuck you're talking about the age of 25. It would make more sense to cite the ages 18 to 21 rather than the age of 25. Your brain doesn't stop developing, most likely, because there are changes in your brain that happen from ages 7 to 90. Brains are silly and goofy, and they will continue to change regardless of the prefrontal cortex. And measuring maturity is a fruitless endeavor because you can't. And none of this is taking into account genetics, neurodivergency, and environment, which I think play a huge fucking role in all of this, but all of our brains look different at age 25, and you cannot depend on neuroscience to, pin down an exact point of maturity, because it's not going to happen, and that's not possible. Not to mention, trying to pin down an objective point of maturity is not only impossible, but also sounds like a terrible idea, because they are going to use that in real life policy, and it's going to cause real life problems, some human rights issues. So maybe let's not advocate for taking away the rights of people you don't think have fully developed brains. I understand you hate children and disabled people, but have you considered that TikTok psychology bad?